for fantastically joining us for this amazing session. And we have three fascinating speakers with us on a panel. Wandile, who is a master's student from the WiCDS, Dr Ojewale and Dr Ndlovu. And we are extremely happy to have them with us. And as per the topic is concerned of our today's discussion and presentation is the politics of naming. And this politics of naming has always been a matter of great concern. Why do we name and why do we do not name certain incidents, certain communities, certain scenarios, certain situations, and so many diverse aspects? And even if we name something, when we call out names, and especially at the time of protests, resistance, violence, and crisis, even when we call out names, what are the different social, cultural, racial, political, and so many other factors that actually contribute widely to this entire politics of naming? So keeping this brief, very brief introductory aspect, now may I request Wandile to share his thoughts with us.
Hi, colleagues. Can you hear me?
Yes, Wandile, you're audible.
Yes, sorry, I'm trying to show the video. Yes. You can see me, yes? So in my presentation, I want to argue 4 points. There's an echo. In my presentation, I want to argue 4 points. I will take you through them. Thanks for having me, colleagues. So, firstly, it's that South Africa's public discourse about protest is not research-based. It is widely thumbsucked. We cannot accurately name protests in South Africa because we don't go through available research in order to categorize protests. Instead, we just simply categorize them as criminal, antisocial behavior without actually focusing into the various social and political and economic realities in social communities where these protests actually take place. This is important because when you diagnose certain protests, catalysts for these protests then can help us decide how to categorize them and not just be able to respond in the way that South Africa responds, which is often through militarization and policing, which has very little to no difference, which makes very little to no difference, as we see that in many communities protests still come up. So policing and militarization is not the issue or is not the solution. Secondly, the underlying causes of protests, of various protests in these various communities is rarely considered. I must make this point because, as we've seen in the past couple of weeks, protest in 2 different provinces were labeled as treasonous through a broad stroke without an actual appreciation that the protests were a Jacob Zuma issue. They were a political, internal ANC factional issue, and so needed a political solution instead of being labeled an insurgency. It was evident that there were competing ANC internal politics within these protests, but the incorrect categorizations led us to do what South Africa always does, which is militarization and over-policing of these protests. My point is that we cannot refrain from applying, we should refrain from applying a national categorizations of protests, and we need to look at the local catalyst causes, such as service delivery, issues such as the political interests that are involved within these communities, and et cetera, et cetera. For example, I know a place where in KZN, it's called Mpumbulu. What happened during the looting was that the locals only looted ATM machines and foreign-owned shops. All the other shops that were owned by locals were deliberately untouched. And for me, this suggests a particular, I guess, premeditated motive for this type of action during this particular time, and you can't categorize them specifically in this community as political insurgents, so localization, naming protests based on the localization context matters very well, and we know that I guess also when we think about xenophobia in South Africa, it's very important that we think of it in this way. The narrative that people are taking our jobs, so we must kill and we must loot them. We know that this comes from times of economic downturn, and we know that politicians scapegoats and then tell communities that the problems are foreign nationals or the so-called outsiders. And in fact, as you might know, this is an international phenomenon. Brexit, the US, so the issue of outsiders and making sure that you properly diagnose certain issues is important. Otherwise, you run a risk of having a wrong president at the wrong time in certain contexts. Thirdly, I want to speak about how naming frames the response. As you know, politicians name protests a certain way so that they can justify responding to them in certain particular ways. The interests are multiple. The methods of protests tell us what kind of protests we are having, but also the response of the state towards certain protests tells us a lot. Either it might be that they do not understand the protests, or they politically disagree with the protests, or because that it delegitimizes them, the political elites and the political order. So it might rather be convenient for them to criminalize the poor instead of listening to them and instead of acting appropriately. Now, I speak here. When I started, I spoke about the importance of relying on research when doing this type of naming and categorizing of protests. So I want to speak about a book from the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. It is titled Patronage Politics Divides Us. And it echoes my argument of competing interests in the architecture of South Africa, in the architecture of South Africa's political economy, and how these competing interests are relevant for us in naming certain types of protests, and are relevant for us in seeing how protests become the way they become and how they form. So, the book argues that there are cleavages between, or at least now in post-apartheid South Africa. So there are differences and there are cleavages between what two issues that were historically common, and these are issues, I guess, that pre-democracy, of course, it was common that the lack of access was common, lack of good service delivery and social mobility was common, and all of a sudden now, post-apartheid, these things are uncommon, and they create differences between and within people who should otherwise share platforms, be it in the same political party, in the same communities. So there's a continuous struggle. And now this continuous struggle is now a continuous struggle between the elites and the poor. And so I guess the protests then happen. But within this themselves, protests happen, they do not happen within and outside this particular context of between the elites and the poor, because the elites are very much also involved in protests, because they also want to have and drive their own agendas within certain types of protests. And Van Holt also has something to say about this, because he says protests sometimes disguise rivalries among the elites, which has an effect of corroding, undermining, and resisting the basis of citizenship. And so, as you can see, there are sinister motives within these various insurgencies that we often see. Last week, a few weeks ago, I wrote an opinion piece in which I argued that socio-economic conditions in the country need to be considered before we can name and categorize protests as either ethnic mobilization or insurgencies or otherwise. I argued this because I sense that people tend to naturally latch onto protest action that promises some sense, or at least a level of economic freedom towards them, but really do not, in the broader scheme of things, have that in mind. I make an argument, for example, that there are very dominant narratives in South Africa about Jacob Zuma. For one, some see him as a symbol for socio-economic justice. They see him as a champion for radical economic transformation. They see him as a victim of white monopoly capital. And this white monopoly capital that seeks to maintain a suffocating socio-economic status quo at all costs. And so if you think about this, this narrative about the former president, and you think about the type of protest then that happened when he was incarcerated, of course, many people would have joined this protest under the banner that they see him as a victim of white monopoly capital, or as a champion of economic justice. But really, in the long run, we must be always careful of other political and internal political ANC battles that are there. And as I've stated already, that the beginning of these protests were really an issue of the ANC and not an issue of the community. So the book also notes that the elites will always make an effort to define units of activities within communities. And this, at the center of this lies the struggle of resources and mobilization. And patronage often serves as a point of mobilization of certain rebellious activities in South Africa. It's important to consider, of course, these issues of patronage politics, because, you know, as a colleague of mine, Kwezi Mabasa, writes in an op-ed again also, he asks a few questions. He asks of us, how it is possible that their local government, or at least local community protests everywhere across the country, as frequently as they are, when research shows us that social services have actually improved, and social delivery has actually, social grants are there, social services have fairly improved. Although there's increased demand, there is evidence that suggests that they are improving. However, we do see that these protests then still continue. And this book suggests that it is because patronage and political interests open up a space for alternative political authority to challenge legitimate institutions of authority, to allocate resources and services. And as such, these organizations and these individuals organize popular marches to voice grievances for social delivery issues, but leave out the interests they have in controlling and controlling resources. In conclusion, I want to say this. So in conclusion, I'm saying this. Protests should be accurately analyzed and defined according to social economic realities of the day and of the location. But also the responsive action of government, political elites matters. The different political factions in support and opposition of the protests and social economic resources tied to the protests matters very much in naming every particular protest. We must be able to accurately name protests and not be reactionary in doing so, because we run the risk of missing shifting social and political trends. And finally, the type and methods of protest is important in naming protests. People in the Zuma protests were taking food, alcohol, clothes, appliances. They took these in particular because of socio-economic conditions of South Africans. And you might argue that not all of them took food, so there was some level of criminality because not all of them were just taking food. But I want to argue that that being unemployed is not the only marker in South Africa for socio-economic inequality. That there are many drivers for socio-economic inequalities, and the fact that they were stealing TVs and food and clothes means that they also are part of the socio-economic inequality brackets. And this is because South Africa is set up on and run on a capitalist consumption economy, so that while those who have jobs cannot afford fancy things, those who do have jobs accumulate more money and afford fancy things. So that's why you see people some who might have jobs, they might be taking washing machines, furniture, plasma TVs. It is to satisfy this gap that exists of socio-economic inequality in our country. So yeah, many competing interests must be considered, and political, economic, and social interests are very important in naming protest, every single protest. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Wandile, for these very important, set of reflections. Obviously, a lot of perspectives to discuss and share. But prior to moving to the next speaker, will anybody be interested to share a couple of very quick comments prior to our next speaker speaking up? So maybe that kind of creates a bridge between the reflections. I mean, in case if nobody's there, I just wish to share a couple of points. And I think it's a very, very important set of reflections that Wandile, you brought to the forefront, and especially with the question of militarization and over-policing of the protests, and also the different socio-political scenario that actually triggers the protests, and how on the basis of different socio-political scenarios that the protests are actually named and categorized. And also the underlying various other factors like the class, gender, racial positions, and who names a protest, who has the authority to name a protest, and who actually thinks about the particular name, what are the factors that contribute to this particular name, is actually some of the very interesting points that you brought to the forefront. Now, may I request Dr. Ndlovu to share the thoughts and our perspectives with us.
Hi, and thank you for the privilege to be invited by the Center for Diversity Studies to engage on this conversation on the politics of naming, which I think it is quite an important topic that we must be engaging, especially given the recent South African, what has come to be known as South African unrest, whatever that means, because it's another form of naming. So for me, I'm not going to be making any arguments. My presentation is more like provocations of some of the issues that I think we should be talking about, some of the issues that I think we should be thinking about widely. Because naming does not come in a vacuum. So naming for me is historical, it is political, it is intentional. It's also a reflection of some different power dynamics that are usually at play when people decide to name something. So we were given about 3 questions to reflect on when we were invited for this talk. And I'm going to be touching on some of those, responding to some of those, but also not as sort of giving responses to the question, but as raising some provocations in terms of opening up a space for discussion. So for me, naming is important, and I love one quote from Toni Morrison's work. It's from one of her interviews, and I quote, so she says, although history should not become a straitjacket which overwhelms and binds, neither should it be forgotten. One must critique it, test it, confront it, and understand it to achieve true adult agency. And close quotes. And Toni Morrison is making this reflection in relation to how most of the African-American identities are formed. And in that, she argues that while African-American people are trying to find their identities, are trying to carve out a particular identity for themselves, this is largely affected by how white people have defined the existence of the African-Americans in terms of framing their history, and also which is in most cases distorted, and which is, I think, in most cases, this is the struggle with the politics of naming, because in most cases it is distorted. So for me, there are important issues to consider when we think of naming, and also in terms of whose voice do we privilege in this naming, because where these views differs, it's usually the case that it's the voices of the protesters themselves against the labels and the identities and the very politics of naming that we impose on the actors, especially those who are at the margins of society, because in most cases, for some reason, we feel like we have the right to define them and to name them in ways that we want to. So for me, one of the most important tools is the power of the media in terms of shaping the narrative, but also in terms of taking the direction of wherever that particular politics goes, because the media then is a space where most people come into contact or come to hear about social issues, about political unrest across our different social contexts. And the media then plays a very important role in terms of shaping the narrative. And for me, it's interesting in terms of the example that prompted today, that provoked today's discussion, the South African unrest. For all we knew, the call out there from the actors, they said Aikale. And whatever Aikale means, maybe someone within the audience cares to explain. I don't know, because I tried to find a translation for Aikale as an instruction that shaped the mobilization and organization prior to the South African unrest. And all I can come up with is different translations or different versions of Aikale, which are also in Nguni languages, something like Isukile, and something like that. So what we all know is, what we all knew during that time was there was an organization around and mobilization around the arrest of the former President Jacob Zuma, and though his supporters organized around Aikale. The next thing, the following day, we had looting. So at what point did we arrive at looting? At what point did Aikale end? I don't know. I don't think also the Aikale ended and then there was the beginning of looting. But I think how our media played a role and how, as different actors in society chose to engage the politics of Aikale versus the politics of looting also matters in terms of how we engage the politics of naming going forward, but also historically and contextually. So for me, the media space then becomes very vital in terms of shaping the narrative, but also in terms of who do they invite within these different spaces, who were the level of a political analyst or an academic who's a political analyst or whosoever, because also within this media space is also mediated. If you look at different media houses, you'll see that for the longest time, they are the same faces who are, I'll put them crude, who are old faces who have been doing political analysis ever since I can remember my history of following the South African news or the South African current affairs. So the question then is, the actors, they continue to change. The faces, even at the forefront of the Aikale moment or looting moment, these were the young people, but you find the people who are doing the analysis are still the same. And if you see a young academic or young political analyst coming in, you'd obviously know that it was a last minute arranged thing. They couldn't find whoever they had called, and then they had to bring this person in, and then their voices are usually marginalized because it's a panel of about 4 or 5 old white men or white women, and then old black people coming into the space to talk about issues that they've been talking forever. And this is problematic for me because these same issues, their perspectives, I argue, they have been shaped by a different political system, but also a different political background in terms of when you think about academia, the epistemological and ontological foundings of their knowledge and knowledge production. They are unmistaken to have followed a particular way, and hence we have this whole narrative around a call for decolonization. So for me, that is also important. The power of the media is important. And my colleague Wandile spoke about the importance of research, and in terms of what do we do with the research and how do we follow it. And for me, the most pitfalls are with us as academics, as researchers. If we enter into the space and we're researching people and we choose to participate in textual violence, they tell us our stories, they tell us about why are they protesting, why are they on the streets, and then what we all do is to come in, we filter their views, we decenter them, and we center our own politics, and we center our own ideas, and then we tend to write stories that do not reflect their genuine issues and all of that. And our constant participation in this politics of erasure, the politics of silencing, and we're silencing the people who are supposed to be speaking about their voices. And if you were looking at the images or following the different media houses during the Aikale moment, I think for me, there were a very few instances where journalists on the ground could really go to the people who are protesting and ask them, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? And all of that. They all asked questions that were relevant to what they wanted to hear. And for me, there was this one moment, this guy, I think, was interviewed by Newsroom Africa, and then he was trying to explain why is he on the streets, and he contextualized the protest for me in the most profound way, and I'll be returning to that towards the end of this brief presentation. Also, in the politics of naming, what is important for me is the intention of the person who's naming or the group of people who are naming. If you go back to the politics of the unrest, of the xenophobic attacks, you will know that how they started, especially the recent one around 2019. But also if you go back to 2007, 2008, just jumping to say this is xenophobic attacks without historicizing the problem, without contextualizing the problem, without even reflecting on the political moment is problematic, because then what then that does is you shift the blame and you reduce it to that particular label that we have already put. And then what then that does, it ignores all the other social factors, political factors, historical factors, economic factors that are surrounding that particular moment. And then what we do after that is the response that then comes, because once you label, you then criminalize that political action or that civil unrest. And then once you have criminalized it, you then bring in the state machine in the form of police to crush the unrest and all of that. And then for that moment, the protest dies, and then it resurfaces again with a different face, because we would have not addressed the root causes of the problem, but we just named it for a purpose of silencing it. And it's the same politics around Fees Must Fall. They were really genuine issues around Fees Must Fall that students were raising, and these issues, they continue to trouble our South African universities and African universities broadly. But if you reduce that to a few hooligans who do not want to go to class, who are unprepared, and put all those labels, and then you criminalize them, and then you want to price them, that problem will continue to resurface, because you are evading the responsibility of addressing that particular social problem that you are facing at that particular moment. And for me, that is very problematic, because then when you do that, you sort of like silence the whole situation. You've silenced the whole problem because you reduced it to a particular label without necessarily looking into the deeper issues, which is what is uncomfortable with me with researchers. I wish we could stop participating in textual violence. I wish we could begin to recenter the voices of the communities that we are researching, so that they can air their grievances in a way that is meaningful to them, because at the end of the day, they are the ones who are living with these situations in a day-to-day basis. And they have So when they frame these issues, they've engaged in a historical, in a contextual, and in a political aspects of all these issues in terms of speaking to them, but also articulating them in ways that are relevant for them. So for me, in closing, it is very important to contextualize the problems, to contextualize the protests in particular, to historicize them, and also to politically ground them. Because for me, the Aikale moment, historically, it had to do with a lot of things that include the long history of apartheid, the political, the transition to the post 1994 order, and all other social and economic crises that are embedded within the South African context. And politically, there was, of course, the politics of Jacob Zuma, which dates a long back within the ANC circles, and that needed to be contextualized before we framed this as looting, the Akale moment as looting, but also contextually, going back as a final point to the guy that I referred to was interviewed by Newsroom Africa when he spoke about the president extended the lockdown yesterday, billions of rands were looted, and all other issues that come into play, the unemployment rates that were already spiking, being exacerbated by the extended lockdown, the retrenchments that were coming in, and intensification of gender-based violence within these spaces are key in order to understand that the Aikale moment came at a fatal, where South Africa was already a fertile ground for such a magnitude of a political unrest to erupt. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ndlovu, for giving us some really very important aspects to ponder about, especially thank you so much for continuing the discussion where Wandile left with respect to the question of who categorizes and how it is categorized, and as you began with the various intentional, political, and the racial factors that actually contribute towards naming, and how it is possible actually to, instead of this usual process of naming from the above, how it is possible to naming from the below, and how that process are consistently being suppressed and silenced through the privileged agencies naming certain incidents with respect to, without really addressing the root concerns. And it was also very interesting to hear about your arguments, that how you talked about recentering the marginalized and, you know, giving them the chance to share their voices and grievances, so that the existing dynamics and the hierarchies of naming can be questioned and dismantled. So with this, we move to our last presenter, and may I request Dr. Ojewale to share the thoughts and reflections.
Thank you so much, Cyan. I'm very, very glad to be here. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible. Yeah.
And then I must consider it a very rare privilege to extending the invitation to the West Africa and zeroing down on Nigeria, maybe based on the peculiar experience that we had in the recent time, which actually reverberated across the country, and also touch on countries even in Europe, North America, and then other places where people who identify with Nigeria are present. So I am very, very happy that you also want to hear our home perspective in this regard. And then I just want to quickly share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
It's visible, Doc.
Okay. So thank you so much once again. So like I was saying, I will try to bring a little bit of a country context into what I will be discussing here. And then when you talk about unrest in Nigeria, we've had a couple of experiences that we can share, but I will just talk along three issues that have triggered on civil unrest, and then even some form of violent unrest in the recent time in Nigeria, and then try to also situate it in the context of who does the naming, and then what has been the potential impact of these conceptualization of different unrest in Nigeria, and then what has been the national impact over the years. So I'm going to be concentrating on three practical experiences that border on communal conflicts. Like you can see on the screen here, this is an experience in the north-central part of Nigeria, where people have been experiencing incessant killing, attacks in towns and villages over time. And at some point, people felt the state is not doing enough, and they had to take to protest, which happened in urban centers in Nigeria, even though the actual experience is a localized experience in the north-central part of the country, but it reverberated, and then people had to take to protest. And then what we have seen in this regard, in terms of what is actually driving the protest, is as a result of perceived or real grievance against neglect from the states, which sometimes the basic responsibility of the state is to be able to provide security and welfare of the, to take care of the security of the people and their welfare. And then when people perceive that the state is not doing enough because people were being killed on a daily basis by violent criminals, so they took to the streets. Most times it yields results, most times it doesn't yield results. Most times it's also lead to violent conflict or violent arrest as against the civil connotation that it might have started with. And then this is also associated with lingering historical grievances across the people who have had to live together for probably decades of years, or maybe over 100 years, over 50 years. And then these at some point leads to, create conflicts, and then it leads to violence. And then we are also witnessing a situation of a livelihood incompatibility, which has also triggered violent experiences in the recent time. And then the other one that actually speaks to the issues that we're talking about here today is ethno-religious bias, which is a form of inability to embrace diversity. Nigeria presents a situation of a country that is where I would say identity is fluid, in the sense that you hear names like you hear names in the media like the predominantly Christian South and then the predominantly Islamic North. These are ways through which people are creating dichotomy and trying to probably create a distinction that actually affects on national cohesion that I will be talking about in terms of the impact of this naming later. And then the second manifestation is in terms of politics. You can see this picture, the top one. Predominantly, we have two major political parties in Nigeria. One is the People's Democratic Party, and the other one is the All Progressive Congress. So these are different protests by both parties who feel like they've been shortchanged as a result of probably electoral outcome, or like the case that you see on the top. The situation below was pre-2015, before General Muhammadu Buhari actually became the president. So they were preempting that there was going to be electoral malpractices that might not go in their favor. And they were mobilizing the public to come behind them, and then to be able to create a sense of identity that people can follow them as an alternative political party. So when civil unrest manifests in Nigeria in terms of politics, the drivers have been power bargaining. People want to access political power by all means. And the other one is elite power sharing. I mean, you have a very small governing elite who, irrespective of their political party identity, irrespective of where they belong to on the other, I mean, on both sides of the divide, it is just one single governing elite. It is one single ruling class who are competing for power. And one of the means through which they have achieved this over time is to also engage in protests like this, and then creating a kind of environment that will make people to probably solidarize, have solidarity with them, or to secure some form of court followership politically. And then a major one that needs to be stressed here in terms of identity politics is ethnic mobilization. So you have people protesting that it is our own turn. And this is not only manifesting at the national level. We've had people who have taken to the street to protest based on ethnic mobilization, even at the subnational level. We have 36 states in Nigeria with over 250 ethnic groups. And what you have is a situation whereby people feel a particular group has occupied power for long and they are being shortchanged, they are being marginalized. So one of the things that they do is that they whip ethnic sentiment to be able to get some people to buy into their political game, or they also whip religious mobilization to get people on board. So these are things that people do to be able to leverage protest to get public buy-in, particularly when it comes to manifestation of civil unrest in politics. And a big one that I think will resonate well is the youth protest that we have in the recent time, which I think also talks about the issue of diversity, which is not too far from inclusion or exclusion. So we had this experience, which was based on, which was largely driven by the youths in October 2020, and that I said reverberated across the world with #EndSARS. So historically, there has been a case of police brutality, which was systematically targeted at the youths, taking advantage of them, locking them up in police cells, manifesting in different ways, economic extortion against the youth. And then at some point, the youth could no longer take it any longer and they took to the streets. So in the real sense of it, what was the final trigger was a case of police brutality, but it was deeper than that. There was a case of a lack of livelihood opportunity, and these statistics might be able to drive home that point. Of the 21.7 million unemployed young people as at the time that this protest took place in Nigeria, age 15 to 34, account for a whopping 34.9%. And the youth also account for 28.2% of the 22.9 million underemployed Nigerians. So this has already created an imbalance. It has created a friction. And when the youth took to the street, they aggregated all their concerns and grievances and put everything squarely on the platform of police brutality as a means to register their grievances against the state in particular. And then going into the issue of naming now, one of the things that we have also seen in Nigeria is that different actors actually name civil unrest in Nigeria. As you can see on this caption, this is the popular toll gate in Lagos, where the military brutality that went viral took place actually. And what we had here is a Yoruba slogan, Sorosoke, which I will literally interpret for you as a speak up. So in this place, these protests, this civil unrest was being coined as, it's one of the words that started moving around that people started biting into at that time in terms of awakening that consciousness in the youth to speak up. So you see these all over the places. It became a trending lingo in Nigeria then. So that is an example of actors naming protest in Nigeria. We also have example of state agents naming protests in Nigeria, like the case against the youth, about the youth protest that I mentioned here. What you see in that situation is that youth are being described in different ways maybe lazy youths, they were unemployed youths engaging in protest. It is because they are jobless, they are jobless youth engaging in protest. So the state gives different coloration also to the protest in Nigeria. And when it boils down to the issue of politics, politicians also whip certain sentiment in naming protest in Nigeria. You've seen protesting, it is PDP that is protesting, it is APC that is protesting, it is a political protest. Irrespective of what they are protesting about at that time, they give it political coloration so as to create that divide. So we've seen politicians also naming protests. And then when it comes to ethnic mobilization, we have also seen different ethnic group, different subnational composition of people, of communities, naming protest in different ways. Like the EndSARS struggle that I talked about, if you study the trajectory of EndSARS struggle in Nigeria, it was largely driven by the youth in the southern part of the country, and that is where it actually gained momentum. So at some point, there are some politicians, some people at the other end of the divide up north were seeing it as a southern protest, not really a pan-Nigerian protest. So that is the kind of coloration that you see sometimes when protest is taking place in Nigeria. And then the last one, which is, the second to the last, which is very, very important, is the role of the media in naming protest. So, and in this regard, it's important to make mention of the dichotomy of the mainstream media and the new media in naming protest in Nigeria, particularly the new media that give protest an hashtag like EndSARS and EndSWAT, all kinds of protests that have taken place in Nigeria, like, and it's also important to say that there is also a protest that is taking place online, a digital protest, where people drive protests in Nigeria, not necessarily in the public square, but in the digital square, and then using certain hashtag to make that to trend in Nigeria. So sometimes in the recent time, we've had such protests that was trying to make the president to remove a particular minister because of certain allegations that were against him. So that was driven through social media engagement, and it was given specific naming in terms of hashtag. And then we also have a protest in Nigeria that have been named by foreign actors as well. Depending on what they want to call it, and consider the protest that is taking place at that particular time. So one thing that we have seen over time in Nigeria is that it creates a wedge that goes down historically, that creates a link between historical experience and contemporary experience, and also create a link even into the future. And what I'm seeing in this regard is that we have had impact, we have had negative fallout of this naming of protests in Nigeria, whereby people go into historical experiences to dig out certain probably unpalatable experiences and use that to reinforce contemporary messaging. So you have a case in Nigeria about crisis that has been going on now, which has some ethnic coloration. And you have a situation whereby a particular ethnic group has been tagged as probably predominant criminal element that is perpetrating that. That also has an historical antecedent. And then it shows how people use historical experiences to explain contemporary realities and creating a link into the future in case the same experience is going to surface again. And the collective impact of these on Nigeria, which we have seen in the recent time, is that it has affected national cohesion in Nigeria. As you can see on this graph, of course, I'm aware that my 15 minutes should probably be close to the end now, but I need to say here that when people use historical experiences to reinforce or interpret contemporary realities and creating a link to the future using that methodology, what we have seen over time is that the national cohesion is being weakened, irrespective of the protest that is taking place. People identify more with their ethnic group. People identify more with their religious group. People even identify more probably with their age group as a result of this naming that has taken place over time. And then you find a situation whereby rather than having a patriotic sense to embrace probably national cohesion, what we are rather seeing is the situation whereby people will rather look for an homogeneous group to identify with, rather than probably have a pan-Nigerian perspective about who they are in terms of their identity, the politics they play, the religious, the group that they belong to, and even the social service that they enjoy or that is being dispensed to them. So in a nutshell, it manifests in different dimensions. It manifests with different impacts, and then much more deeper concern for us is the impact, the connotation that these we have on the future trajectory of the country. Unborn children, this same issue is going to be passed across to them in terms of the strategy through which people probably try to pull down the other group, try to maybe play to their advantage in terms of who to dispense resources to, who to assess probably national social services or whatever. So this is the major concern that we have had. I'm very sure the 2020 result of the National Social Cohesion Survey is going to be out again. And I'm not expecting anything different, because much more than ever before, Nigeria is living in a precarious situation whereby the sense of division has become stronger in the recent time as a result of how we have played and responded to people's grievances when it comes to issues of civil unrest. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ojewale, for your fascinating reflections. And prior to moving to the question answer, I think it's very interesting how Dr. Ojewale actually carried forward the very problem shared by Dr. Ndlovu about naming a particular crisis, naming protests without really getting into its roots and trying to understand the root causes, and it's being reflected on in the context of Nigeria, and how certain protests are given communal names as a predominantly a Christian South, as set as an example by Doc, and predominantly Muslim North, and also about how the different agents, in order to satisfy their respective social political agendas, name the protests in their own ways without really considering the various factors, without honestly considering the various factors that has caused the protest. The different state agents, politicians, media houses, foreign actors, and so many other aspects that Doc brought to the forefront. Now, let us open the platform for questions, reflections, colleagues. In case if you have questions and reflections, agreements, disagreements, whatever you feel free to share, you can please put it in the chat box, or else if you wish to unmute yourself and ask directly, share directly, please feel free to do that as well. Meanwhile, as you do that, I see that Grace Ndlovu has a comment in the chat box, and it says that according to my understanding, Aikale could be translated as Mazilim Zietcheni. So I don't know, Grace, would you like to share more perspectives on it, more comments, or apart from that, in connection to it, if you have anything else to share, would you like to do that? And in case you wish to, please feel free to unmute yourself and share with us. I mean, meanwhile, as people people are thinking and working on their reflections and perspectives, I was just wondering to ask one thing, which actually I found is very much a part of the reflections of all the three speakers today, is to figure out the ways to name a protest in the right manner. But my question is, I mean, obviously a lot of perspectives have come to the forefront. For instance, how it is named in a wrong manner, how the marginalized voices, the suppressed voices can be recentered to share their sufferings to the forefront. But still, I was wondering that, is it really, I mean, how much is it possible to figure out? Still, how much is it possible to figure out if protests can be named in the right manner? And still the question persists that who makes the decision? I mean, whether it's from the below or whether it's from the above, whether it's from the privilege or whether it's from the marginal sections, but still the question remains, who makes the decision? And how can we again distinguish very categorically the right name for a protest and a wrong name for a protest? So maybe if anybody would like to share amongst the three speakers and along with the rest.
Okay, can I take the first shot?
Oh, sure, Doc, please do.
Well, I think it's a bit difficult now by the time you position this in the context of new media, and then who is also pushing the agenda, particularly in this era of a social media influencer, and then the kind of cult followership that they have. And it's also in the context of Nigeria, you also need to look at, you also have to look through the identity lens of who is probably naming a protest. So it's a bit of complicated nuances that you have to be able to read deeply into the body language of the person that is probably naming a protest, because almost I mean, NSAS was supposed to be a pan-Nigerian protest in Nigeria, but politicians have a way of creating a wedge to see how they can create that division, because most Nigerian youth who participated in the NSAS, if you gauge the temperature at some point, the objective is to provoke a democratic change. That was it. And then when politicians look at the figure and they realize that 2023 is coming, and then if you allow this narrative to go for long, they needed to devise different means to create a division. And that is the reason why you started seeing conversation that try to frame the NSAS protest in Nigeria as a Southern protest, a protest among Southern youths, framing it along the line of maybe they can also import religion into it. And then at the same time, a protest also started in Nigeria, in the northern part of the country, but that didn't gain momentum as expected by the actors, and it was Secure Not. It was an hashtag Secure Not. The whole idea is, well, you're talking about police brutality in the southern part of the country, but the major challenge we're facing in this part is insecurity. And to this extent, we also want to float a parallel protest. So you see that, and then it becomes a little bit naughty to be able to identify what message, the coherence of message in all these experiences. But what I'm going to handle on is that if you're able to secure a buy-in of a wider stakeholders, and then I think to a large extent, if the message is clear and it's about driving a positive change in a contest, it does not necessarily matter who is framing, who is naming the protest. What is important is that you are able to achieve that collective desire, which is probably to cause some positive change. But what has been an uphill task in all these things is that politicians come to with identity agenda, and then the protest, sometimes the protest is derailed. Thank you.
Thanks, Doc, for your reflections. Like, would any of the other speakers would like to share their thoughts about it?
Yes, I will respond also to the question, I'll share my views on the question. So the question is there a possibility of getting the naming right? I think I follow my colleague to say it's difficult naming right because of the different spaces where people can articulate themselves. But also within the movement itself or within a protest itself, you'll find different people with different interests, because also these protests are never homogeneous. Although they start with a particular cause, they will, you end up with different people joining the movement and pushing different causes. But I think it's important also to get the naming right, depending on what you want to achieve. And I say this because naming is never in vacuum. Naming is always political. Naming is intentional. You name something with an intention to do something about it. So if you are really concerned about understanding and naming this particular protest, you need to understand what is it all about. And for academics who are wishing to understand what the protests are all about and how are they named in that particular way, it's important that they listen to the actors on the ground, they listen to the protesters and understand what are the actual grievances, and even prompt, what does it mean to say Aikali? To understand that on its own is also key for journalists to shape the correct narrative to the public. If they're interested in shaping the narrative in a way that privileges the actors on the ground, they have a responsibility to ask the protesters on the ground to say, what are you protesting about? Why is it important for you? And how did you come to join? And all those questions are very necessary. And finally, for politicians or for policymakers for that matter, if you are really interested about changing the landscape of violence in a particular country, and in a country with a reputation like South Africa, it's very key that we change the landscape of violence, drawing from our own historical perspective of the experience of apartheid, passing the township revolts of the 1980s, and then the post-1994 protests, especially around 1996 going to the early 2000s, and coming to the period of FISMAS4 to where we are at now, because we seem to be keeping on repeating the same struggles, but they are framed in different ways. So it looks like it's the same struggle, but it's named and framed and sparked by different things and in different ways. So if you are really interested, it's important to go back to the actors and ask them, because when we rush to name, we erase that event, we erase that particular protest, because then we are seeking an intervention, and then we intervene as per how we have named it. And then that's how we keep on seeing this violence keeping on erupting and erupting, because you have not addressed the root causes, you have not understood what is the problem. If you really seek to understand what is the real cause, you need to ask the protectors. And as a policymaker, as a politician, it is key to understand what are the grievances. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doc, for your reflections. Prior to going to the questions, I don't know if Wandile wants to say anything, because I saw him putting on his video and audio.
No. I think Hlengiwe covered me. I was just to say that because protests are not homogeneous, so there will always be competing interests in different protests, especially in the context, as Dr. Ojewale has explained, especially in South Africa, in the context of battling social cohesion. There will always be contesting ideas within protests, and so it's going to be very difficult to appropriately name and get a coherence buy-in from everyone. What we should concentrate on is achieving the desired outcome. really.
Thanks.
So whether just the main desired outcome, yeah.
Thanks, Wandile, for your reflections, and thanks, Docs, for your fascinating reflections. May I now request Kudzai to share his reflections?
Thanks, Sayun, and thanks to our panel for the great presentation. And I guess Wandile did cover on my question at the end. And my question or reflection is around outcomes. So while we have spoken about naming the protests, and I'm thinking about naming the outcomes, and from a gender perspective, where we tend to find that most of the protests that happen in, for example, in these contexts that we've discussed, if we talk about maybe fees must fall, and if we talk about the recent protests that took place in South Africa, there's no denying sort of the toxic masculinity that exists, even if we think about the xenophobic attacks. So my question is really around how we can think of the naming of the protests as a very political game, but on the other end of the protesters, or thinking about the protesters, there is that issue of naming outcomes, and unfortunately those outcomes are less of, well, probably part of the political game, but become less a concern of the politicians, which is then for me a worry. And maybe perhaps what are some of our thoughts on giving the example of gender, the fact that some of these protests are really sparked through or motivated through a very masculine approach, and are very connected to the locals, to the micro violences that occur, particularly domestic or gender-based violence, and what really we can think of as researchers, and if we have politicians in our midst, in relation to naming outcomes and sort of the implications and the consequences and the things that actually do happen during and after the protests are over, after sort of the media has left and the naming has occurred. Because if you think about the protests in Durban, for example, what is the aftermath named? What is it called? How is it framed? What is the sort of deprivation that continues to exist after these protests have taken place? What place is it given in the politics of naming, and I guess that's one thing I'm just thinking about. So it could just be sort of some sort of a reflection / question. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Kudzai, for your reflections. Would the panelists like to address this, share some thoughts, or anybody else who were there with us today? Would anybody like to come forward and share thoughts? Please feel free to do that.
I see Daniel's hand is up as well, Shai.
Yes, but prior to Daniel's thoughts, I see Dr. Ndlovu. Would you like to share some thoughts, I guess?
Yes, very briefly in terms of outcomes, in terms of naming outcomes, but also outcomes that are going to come from these particular organized actions. So in terms of outcomes, I think it depends on whether the protest is an organized movement, or some of them are just spontaneous protests, for the lack of a better politically correct word, like looking at the Aikali moment. So the whole organization and mobilization was around the release of the former President Jacob Zuma, and that escalated to something that came to be named as looting. And then there was very serious there was very serious police violence to an extent of deploying the army to crush the movement. So usually in organized movements, they will have the short-term goals and then they will have the longer-term goals. So if you are going to take the Fees Must Fall movement as an example, the initial the initial concern was the exorbitant fees that they were paying. So the students did not want fees to increase, but that comes with a whole lot of issues. And also it has to do with when you achieve this outcome, you realize that applying pressure on government or whoever is responsible on authorities, there is an opportunity to increase your demands, and then you get to achieve something else. And then hence we escalated to free, decolonized, quality education. And what is important there is the naming, because when journalists would interview students and then they talk about free education, there will always be a correction. It's not just free education, it's free quality. And then you omit decolonize. And I remember Busiswe Siabe would articulate it in a very like emphasized way to say it's free quality decolonized education, to mean that this is the goal of where we want to go to. No matter how we get there, but this is the ultimate goal. So this is taking into consideration that you may not achieve everything overnight. You must have short-term goals and longer-term goals. But in terms of spontaneous protests, the goal sometimes gets to be entangled within the bigger goal. So the Aikale moment was free Jacob Zuma. Jacob Zuma is still in prison today, but the protests went on anyway. So if you would have asked some of the protesters there, some of them, they didn't know even that former President Jacob Zuma was in prison. They participated because they joined the protests and because the socio-economic atmosphere was sort of like ripe enough to trigger that particular response. So it's difficult in terms of naming outcomes, but the people who are actually organizing these protests and all, and also given their nature, if they're organized, you can have the clear articulated outcomes, but if they are not, sometimes you might not. You can just get a trigger of what triggered this particular protest, but not the actual outcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Doc, for your reflections. Now, may I ask Daniel to share his question?
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Nenga Daniel, and I'm joining from Abuja in Nigeria. For me, I think that sometimes this naming process is it happens accidentally, and there is nobody who had a conscious decision or a strategy of giving a name, and so the name simply just emerges along with the movement. Like if you take the NSAS protest that Dr. Ojewale discussed just a moment ago. This was a hashtag that was used by someone who had a very bitter experience with that formation of the police, and he ended his tweet with that hashtag, say, NSAS. And by the time it crystallized into the name of a movement, it immediately became clear that The name was not something that would mobilize every person, around the grievances that, they had around police reforms in Nigeria. There were many people who liked that unit of police, SARS, and they felt like the communities are safer with the operation of the SARS. There were also people who don't want the arm of the police to be completely scrapped, as the protesters were asking for. They wanted to reform, not disbandment. So you find out that sometimes it's the loudest person, the one with the social media access, the one who gets to talk to the Al Jazeera and the CNN and so on, who has the privilege of giving the name. And so it becomes limiting in a way that because of the name that the movement is having, not everyone is able to join them. Another example of like accidental naming is that what has happened in South Africa more than once actually, which people call xenophobic attacks. I think that, if it didn't have that name, xenophobia, I mean, personally, I've written an article in the past, and I think that the event should be called terrorism, when citizens simply rise up against their neighbors and start to destroy lives and livelihood. It's really terrorism. It shouldn't be called xenophobia. But giving it such a name actually looks like already excusing, speaking on behalf of the people who are involved in this kind of movement. So I think that sometimes the media has a responsibility of questioning the names that protest movements give themselves or others are giving to the movement, and allowing the possibility of alternative names to describe the same phenomena. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for your reflections about accidental naming, which is actually quite interesting, but also it brings us to the point that I mean, every form of naming, I mean, whether it's accidental or deliberate, has a root. So it's also somewhat necessary to really delve into the roots that, or the root factors that cause the accident actually. I don't know if the panelists or the other participants have certain points to reflect on share with respect to Daniel's comments.
Thank you so much, Sonia. I think I quite agree with Daniel from Nigeria with respect to the fact that sometimes this is an accidental experience, and then although it creates a glue that people can easily identify with. But I think what is much more intriguing for me, for us to reflect on and interrogate as we part from probably this meeting and for further future reflection, is the role of social media in all these things. It appears to me now that everything is framed by the social media now, and the mainstream media just have to catch up in terms of that spontaneity, and then before everybody start processing the whole idea in their head, it has already become a wildfire. And then it matters who is actually pushing a personal or a provincial narrative in this whole issue, because at the end of everything, where every civil unrest is political, it is to achieve a political end, not necessarily to topple a government, but probably to get the attention of government or to achieve one end or the other. So for me, what I found very intriguing now is the role of the social media. 40, 30 years ago, there were protests all over the place. I mean, protests is as old as man. I mean, there was a protest to the Garden of Eden, don't do this. I mean, they went ahead to do the other thing. So you found a situation whereby things happen in South Africa, and then we that were in Nigeria were the one that are sending pictures to people in South Africa about how people were carrying all kinds of things. It shows the extent to which things can actually go viral. And in this age and time, depending on the social media engagement as well. You can find out that something might be happening in South Africa, and some people in faraway US or maybe Europe or Nigeria have bought into the idea, and they are even probably more tweeting than people in South Africa. And the thing is, a lot of people that are going to join the tweeting might not even have an idea of where the whole conversation is coming from, but they also want to join. So you need to look at the interplay of technology, globalization. Otherwise, you might frame an idea within a context in your country and it catches wildfire and it derails completely. And it becomes another thing entirely. So for me, it's intriguing to look at the role of social media in all these things and to hang on the note that by and large, whether the social media or the mainstream media, there's a responsibility to make people to see what they need to see within the context of what is being protested about. We rarely see that at times. And then you see certain provincial interest being pushed, whether from a particular group of people, a particular population group, or a particular ethnic group or religious group, or a particular age group. This is what we mostly see at times. And to quickly talk about Kurt's question, I think one of the challenges that we've had in the recent time is that to the extent that every unrest, civil unrest, is trying to achieve a political game, a political end, the politicians are always too quick to read ahead and terminate or derail or frustrate such agenda. So most of the times the outcome is lost. And because attention span is very, very short, 2-3 weeks down the line, people have already moved into other things. And this thing is also precipitated by social media. Social media is framing everything now to the extent that we've forgotten that we actually had NSAS in Nigeria. A lot of other issues have come. We forgot, I'm not in South Africa, but the recent unrest is no longer on the front burner, whereas the drivers of such unrest, they are still there. The fault line are still very, very clear, but we are too quick to move into other things because we can't really sustain a conversation for long. And that is the reason why I won't be surprised if 2 years down the line, this thing resurrects again, because the outcome probably not well defined or most of the times derailed by politicians. Thank you.
Thank you, Doc, for your very important reflections. Doc Ndlovu, would you like to share some thoughts? Maybe that could be the final ones prior to we come to an end.
Very quick on the input around the naming being a complex process, and I do agree that it is sometimes accidental because it happens along once the action is already started, and then you only get to name. And for me, the context remains key in terms of understanding the context on which that particular action emerged. Because when you remove that protest from its context, when you remove everything that's surrounding it, then you stand a chance to distort, first of all, what is happening, but also in most cases, it's not by distortion, or it does not emerge from a point of misunderstanding. Of course, the role of social media is very key nowadays, but when a conscious actor decides to tweet about something or to name something as something, they have an intention, they have an agenda to drive in terms of what do they want to achieve with what they are saying, and they have a particular frame that they're trying to create around that particular event. And in terms of who is naming also is very key, because in most cases, if you name with an intention to avert responsibility, for instance, if you were going to talk about the xenophobic attacks of 2019, it's easier for whoever is responsible to say it's xenophobic attacks. Because once you reduce it to that, then you have masked every responsibility. But if you go back to how they started, a taxi driver trying to talk to somebody who is caught selling drugs to a child, to a school child, and then they're trying to stop that action, and then the taxi driver gets shot, and then all taxi drivers coming out to say, we're going to fight and kill everyone in retaliation. And then that goes out of control, and then you reduce it to xenophobic attacks. Because if you say, this is a question, this started with fighting drugs, it raises bigger questions in terms of who is the drug lord, how did they pass through the regulations at the airport, who is responsible, and where were the authorities, the immigration authorities, and all of them, all these people are supposed to be managing this situation. So in an attempt to mask all the failures of the system, to say our system in South Africa is in a state of mess. We can't control our borders in terms of drugs, drug trafficking, and all of that. Our customs is a mess, and this is because there are big political people who are participating in these networks, and they can't be pointed out. It's so easier to reduce it to xenophobic attacks, because then it becomes a question of xenophobic attacks, and then it can be dismissed. And this is not to excuse the actions of the people who are actually participating in the protest itself and their intentions, but it's to say, if we are to understand these problems, we need to dig deeper into their historic context, but also to consider the context on which they emerge. If you saw how much President Cyril Ramaphosa started by saying, this is an ethnical rebellion, to say these are the Zulus, mobilizing themselves around one particular political figure without necessarily reading the context on where all this is emerging and what are the socio-economic and political issues, let alone how, as a country, we came from Nazareth in 2017, how we emerged with a one political party that was in itself because it was just, you were just trying to hold a political party that is already in tatters together in the name of unity. And that is now boiling out, and then it's spiraling out of control. And then if you reduce it to ethnical rebellion, and then eventually people are looting, it's so easier to evade all these responsibilities, especially for the people in power. So for me, the context is very key when we are to understand some of these social actions, especially the protests that I mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doc. And thank you, every panelists and participants for being a part of this presentation and discussion today. Now we are almost on the verge of wrapping up, and prior to that, may I invite Melissa Stein to share her thoughts.
Sharon, I unfortunately had to step out, so I've missed all of the discussion, so I wouldn't like to actually weigh in, because I'll probably be cutting across a lot of what has been said. So unfortunately, yeah, I have to pass.
No worries, Melissa. It's perfectly fine. May I request Kudzai to share some updates about the conference that we are about to conduct in the coming 2 months.
Thanks for this opportunity to speak on the conference. I just wanted to share with everyone who is in attendance that we're going to be having, we couldn't have it last year, but this year it's back and it's going to be online. And I've shared in the chat the the link to the conference website where you can be able to submit your abstracts. So yeah, basically the conference is titled Wokeness, Sleepwalking.
Kutsai, your voice is breaking up. Your voice is breaking up, Kutsai.
Social justice discourse. It's a very interesting conference because we always have these very exciting. But I mean, just to cut it short, I have shared the details of the conference in the chat, and people can access it there.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Kutsai. As I understand, his voice was breaking up a bit. Just to update you that the details are there in the website, and we all, on behalf of WiCDS, warmly invite you and request you to, please join us and participate actively in the conference, and also please feel free to share with your colleagues, students, researchers, and anywhere around, and encourage them to be a part of this event. We are very much looking forward to have you there with us. And also I thank you, all of you, once again for this such a fascinating and active participation. It was great to have all of you with us today in this discussion. And obviously it's a never-ending process, so we look forward to continue with these discussions and reflections in the coming days as well. Meanwhile,